I've gone ahead and rendered out the matte painting where it is as of right now. And what this render represents is from the last time that you saw it was simply just going through and hitting that list that we talked about before. And this is several iterations later of hitting stuff on the list, rendering out, see what's broken, fixing it again, and then just doing that several times and to a place where I'm things are not broken, things are in a pretty good spot. And so let me show you the shot and talk to you about some of the things that that I did on the shot, and I can go back and show you how I did some of those. It's the process of making a list and going through and making these changes can take a long time and be a little bit tedious, and it goes back and forth. So it's not very practical for me to record every single thing that every little fix that I did to the shot, but I can go back and I can show you some of those things that I did. So let's go ahead and play this. All right. You can see that there's a gravestone here that I've changed out. It was another one. I was looking for a more interesting gravestone that had some perspective already built into it. And I built it in a way that I could move it into place. And so I'll be showing you how I did that. You can see that I lost the firelight on the angel. It was a nice thought, but overall I felt like it made the focus somewhere else besides our Gothic structure here, and so that kind of fell on the altar of the shot. As cool as it was, I decided to get rid of it. You could see there's this whole base right here that I've masked out, and so I'll talk to you about that. And I dimensionalized some other trees, the same process that we went through. There's a bunch of stuff up here that I broke into different layers. Like this used to be all one layer up going up on this hill, and I broke that out separately. It was one image, but I made them two different images and painted behind one. And so I can show you that as well. There's a lot of fixes. Down here at the end, there's a patch that there was all this smearing that went across. And so I went and I fixed all of that stuff. I put shadows in for the angel, which I thought was kind of nice, and for the cross. I ended up subduing a little bit of the sky and adding some haze back in the background, and I thought that worked out better. So yeah, so now that we've taken a look at this and you've seen some of the things that I've done, and it's looking a lot more polished now, I'll go through and we'll talk about individually some of the things that I've done, and I'll show you at the same time some tricks and some useful things that you can do within your Nuke script to make things easier for yourself. So let me show you first how I've broken up that image up on the hill. So if we take a look at these two images here, let me just make room, zoom in. So these used to be two or one image, actually. When I took the photograph, this was all one image. And so I needed to go through and I needed to separate these two images. And you can see that I've lopped off the top here so that we don't have a doubling of the same gravestone on the card behind it. And also what I've done is I've cloned into, let me just brighten that a little bit. I've cloned into the gravestone so that when this gravestone moves in front of the other image, you won't see two of the same, or the edge poking through the backside. And so if we look at this in 3D view here, so we can see that all of these guys were on this plane, and I noticed that they do slip against each other, and that this should be farther up, closer. And so in our camera move, you can see that it can move freely in front of the other one without any problem. The next thing I can show you is the patch that I created for our let me just go down here and show you the render without the patch. Alright, this is the area that we were looking at before. So I did create a patch, so let's just turn that off so you can see what it looked like before. Yeah, so this stair right here doubled back onto this. And the reason that that's happening is because my Hero projection camera, because I was trying to get a good angle so I could get enough coverage for the projection. That was a compromise that I made, because what you could do is you could make it your Hero projection camera at the last frame, but when, I don't know if you remember before, but when we were that close, it was hard to open up the focal length enough to minimize the distortion. So what I ended up doing is taking the shot camera and rolling it back several frames so that we could get a more pleasing projection. And so the result is that I need to do a patch later to fix this area. So simply for patches, it's very easy. All you do is you just write out this image and bring this image into Photoshop, and then you see the offending area right here, and you just paint on top of it, and then you turn off the background layer of what you've just rendered, and you only include the patch. So let me show you what the patch looks like. So there is the patch that fixes that area. So I hit the top a little bit, and I got the side, and some of the sidewalk in the background there. And so that's all the patch consists of. So I had my render on one layer on the background, and I had all of this stuff on another layer, and I just turned off the background so that all I'm getting is just this patch. And I'm at frame 100 where the smearing is the worst. So now if I'm going to project this patch onto our geometry, it's a completely different projection. And so the easy way to do that is you just go up here to your camera. Copy and paste that guy. And then make sure you're on the frame that you need, and the frame that we need is 100. And then you just go over here and say no animation on all knobs. You say yes. And so that kills the animation. So this now is a static camera. And so and that's what I've done here, is made a static camera. So this is a static camera that's not moving on the last frame. And I would just set it up like a normal projection. Right here is the Proj 3D, the camera input and the image input. And then I'm doing a merge material, a merge matte node, and I'm going A over B. And then I'm feeding that into my object. And then that lays on top of that image, and it works out nice right there. And so that's how you do patches. And back when I was talking about setting up projections and minimizing your smearing and all that kind of stuff, this is one of those steps that you need to take. Usually your patchwork, if there's some big color change or something like that, if this goes from a day, they want it to be a daylight thing now, you could go back through all of your main projections and fix all that. But typically your patches you're going to have to redo because that's really kind of based on the paint work that's in your main projections, and so this kind of follows those. And so this little, paint patches kind of thing does become throwaway work, or would be qualified as throwaway work. However, I do have a Photoshop file with this, and it's color corrected to match down to this. So it doesn't always have to be throwaway work, but some of this stuff I just cloned right off of my other projection, and so this stuff I would have to reclone. And this side right here I pulled from an image and color corrected it down, so I wouldn't have to recreate this, but I would have to recreate all this other stuff. So let me show you now the gravestone that I created. Let me just copy and paste this over here so we can look at it. Oh, I forgot the geo. So what I was doing for this gravestone, I was having a hard time, and if we take a look at this, let's go back a little bit. I was having a hard time placing this gravestone in the right spot, and it was originally a part of one of these projections up here. It was a part of this projection here, and I had placed it in here and then just had geometry catching it. And the problem was that it was too disconnected from the shot. And so I would move the geo and then I would move the image to correspond, and it was just too much of a loop process where I'd have to hit Photoshop and then hit Maya and then come back to Nuke, and it was just too much of a pain to try to compose that in the right spot. And I put it there because I was trying to hide the base. I never meant the base of this angel to be seen, and that's kind of an unresolved area. So, and it's cool, I think, to have stuff like just passing really close to camera like that. So, so I wanted to be able to position this in 3D space in the right exact position. So to do that, I had this photo of the gravestone here, and let me just show you the image. That's the gravestone image that I have, and it was already the other one didn't have this edge on it. It didn't have the right perspective, and so this one was much better and a lot more interesting. So I decided to chuck that one and use this one instead. Let's take a look. So what I ended up doing is that I just made a camera in Maya and started in a blank scene, and it didn't have anything to do with the shot or the placement or anything, the scale or anything. I just created a camera and then projected that onto a piece of geometry and then modeled underneath that geometry very loosely. As you can see, there's not a ton of detail in there. Mostly what I was concerned about was getting a nice edge on it. So after modeling this thing based on the projection, now I'm going to take this and move it into the right place. And I'm going to move it all together. So if you notice, if I wanted to move the geometry, what happens is that the projection camera stays in the same spot, but the geo moves. And so there's a lot of times where you're doing projections in Nuke and you just need to bump your projections or you need to move it together. So what you would have to do is you'd have to move your camera and try to figure out how to move this at the same spot, or you go into Maya and you make the change and then bring it back into Nuke, and that's kind of a pain. So the much better way to do that is to use an axis node where you can move your camera and your geometry at the same time. So to do that, you go ahead here and you create a transform geo node. And when you see the transform geo node, it has a little axis noodle right here that you're going to plug your axis into. And then let's create an axis. So let's plug that right into the axis now. And now we should, like if we just move our, so now we're moving our piece of geometry, but we're doing it through the axis node. But still the camera is not moving with the piece of geometry. So what we need to do here is we need to take this little noodle. You've probably been wondering what this little noodle is for. This is it. You take this noodle and plug it into the axis. So now this axis is driving the placement of the projection camera and the geo. So now if I move them, they move together. And so with that, I'm able to, rotate this thing and move it and do all kinds of things that I need to do with it to place it exactly where I need it to be in the shot. So that's a very useful trick in Nuke when you're talking about projections, and I use that quite extensively. So I'm just going to go ahead and trash that. You can see that with my cross here, it wasn't lining up exactly the way I wanted it. And so I did the same thing with this. Even though it was originally a part of my secondary projection camera, I broke it out separately. So now I have the proj cam here and I have my axis node, and now it's separate. I'm moving it independently of the other projection. And so I can move it up and down to exactly where I want it to be. And if you've noticed in my script, I have this little node right here that's being connected with all these green lines to all my scanline renders. So I've got a lot of scanline renders in this project. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right before I render, in this last render, it doesn't represent motion blur. So to put motion blur into my matte painting, I would go here to the scanline render, and up in samples, I would up the samples. It's a little more, there's other ways to do motion blur, like move motion vectors through your scanline render and then use like a motion vector node and things like that. But this way, you know, it's an easy way to get motion blur, and if you're not really worried about render times, and even though you look at the script and it's quite, you know, it's not huge, it's not a huge script, but it's a whole shot, this still renders way faster than anything that you would do in 3D, because all it's calculating is projections. It's not like trying to calculate light or ray tracing or anything like that. So still, even though there's all this stuff in this file, it's still really light render. And so if you're not worried about render times, and you can ump your samples, and this multi-sample will actually give you real motion blur that will respect a curved camera move, and it won't make your motion blur linear, but it'll actually curve your motion blur, so it, from frame to frame, which is a nice thing. So right here, I'm not worried about the sampling. I'm not worried about the increased render time from upping the samples. So what I can do here, but I have 8 of these scanline renders. So right before I render, I don't want to go to every single scanline render and then up the samples and then go back to my file and then lower the samples so that I can work on the file. Because if you up the samples, you don't want to work that way, because it increases your time that you're just doing comp work. So what I did was I created this node, and it's a no operation node. And so the way that you create one of these is you just press tab and you just type in no op right there. And basically this is an empty node that has nothing, absolutely nothing to it. So if you, let's clear these out, double click on this guy. So if you right click on this and go to manage user knobs, it's going to bring up this little display window, and you can go up here and you can go add, and I added an integer knob. And so they have all different kinds of knobs that you can create within this, within your user menu here. So we're going to do an integer knob, and we're just going to name it samples there. And so now you can see over here, it's popped in here, and it's made its a little thing here, and it's named it samples. And so now I have an integer knob. If I wanted to do something else, then I could come up here and I could create a 3D floating point slider. I use those quite a bit. So then say the minimum is negative 100. And the maximum is 100, and then there you are. You have your little sample slider, or your little slider there, and this slider could be used to drive other nodes. So, oops, let's go here and just delete this guy. Delete. Okay. So now that I have this no operation knob, what I can do is I can just click on this scanline render, and I can, if you control click, well, actually, let me just create a new scanline render here so you can see this. So right here are samples, and this is our no operation node. If you press control left click and then drag it into this spot, now there's this little connection that's being made here. So now what I can do is I can up this to 20. Oh, excuse me. I had that actually the wrong way. Here we go. So if we do no animation to clear out that. So if you go here and drag it down to there, now I had it the wrong way. So now this is driving this. So if we change this to 10, this will change to 10. If you change it to 5, it'll change to 5. And if you right click on this and go to edit expression, oftentimes I'll just go in here and type these in manually. But to explain this, it says parent. So it's saying that you need to go out of this node. And so that's what that parent means. It says go out of this node and go into no op 1. That's the name of this node. So if I named this to samples, then this would have to be samples. And then right here, samples here is the name of this field right here. So, and they're all separated with a period. So that's how you do that. So that's a really easy way to do stuff, and Nuke is pretty fantastic when it comes to that kind of stuff, and really just opens up everything for you to do, to control different values and things like that, which makes it, very nice to use. And right over here, I've done the same thing with this light controls. This was my this is a no op operation thing, and I went in here and created an RGB value here. So if you go in here, same thing. If we go edit, this is an RGB color knob. So if you go add, there's one RGB color knob. So if you remember, on this grade, we're having this curve tool drive this color grade, right? And if we go in here and go edit expression, before we had times 20. And anytime that we wanted to change the color of our light inside here, we had to open up and go edit expression and then add a multiplier to this because when you're doing the curve tool, it's such a low value. So, but what I did was same basic idea. So I said times, but times by parent. So go out of this node, go into a node called light controls, and then go into a user menu called Arc Firelight, and then go into the R, specifically the R, which is this guy, R. That's the box. That's the name of that box. And so if we looked at this guy, edit expression, it says go into G, the G box. And so now I can go into here and I can just quickly, really amp up stuff, and and I don't have to go into those those boxes, and I can adjust all my color corrections from there. So that's another use of using little expressions within your nodes that makes it very useful for you, so that you don't have to do all of that work. So like I said, I feel like this matte painting is in a good place. There's just one more thing that I would like to add to it, and it's some ground fog. Um, and you may be thinking, oh, ground fog, that sounds like a difficult thing to do and would take a long time. It's actually quite easy and quite fast. And the reason it is easy and fast is because we have projected onto 3D geometry, and now we have 3D placement of all of the objects. And so we can actually render out a 3D element, a 3D element image sequence, and then comp it on top of our matte painting, and it will work fine. And so, what you do need to make sure, like in this area here, there's you can build geometry that will catch a projection, but the alpha channel cuts out the image. So you could have a piece of geometry come way out here, and like I did on this, I actually had that on this cross, where the geometry poked out really far, and it didn't really matter because the alpha of the image cut it out, so we didn't actually see the edge of the piece of geometry. But because now I'm going to be using a 3D element within this scene, then I went through and I tightened up the model on all of these things. So I tightened up this model. There was some tightening that I needed to do up in here, and this thing matches pretty nicely already. So that way, when I put an element on top of this, it's going to align up really well. So now that we've kind of looked over all the things that I've done to the matte painting, then let's go into Maya and let's create our fog and our kind of our mist that we're going to add to this shot.